About 60% of African countries risk defaulting on their debt if the slow rollout of alternative financing from rich countries is not unlocked on time. CNBC Africa had a panel discussion on the role of special drawing rights in lowering the cost of capital. Here's more.
We at Africa Catalyst organized with the Center for Global Development, we co-hosted last week an event on how we could use SDR more effectively as additional financing for African countries. As you know, back in August 2021, there was a growing in the amount of 650 billion, and Africa received 33 billion out of that amount. And the subsequent to that issuance, the G20 committed to rechannel or to recycle about 100 billion of SDRs for vulnerable low-income and middle-income countries. So the idea of our was to see how that risk of SDR could help African. There's a number of challenges they're facing now, as you know. On top of the pandemic that we went through, there is now the crisis that is related to the Ukraine situation. There is also a number of challenges in African countries as it relates to climate change, as it also relates to a number of other issues like debt and also infrastructure spending. So all of those needs, actually, we were trying to see as part of this discussion how SDRs, using SDRs innovatively could help address those needs. And that was the idea. And we had certainly I will have the opportunity to come back in detail on that, but we had discussed that issue with key civil society organization, but also from senior officials from the African Development Bank who came a very innovative proposal on how we could help channel SDRs toward multilateral development bank to help increase financing for African countries. We certainly will have an opportunity to come back to that.
That you're bringing up there, and I'd like to also just allow David to also chip in. And what's your general assessment? Are we on the right trajectory in regards to tapping into this special drawing rights that we've continued to be following as a continent?
We've got about 60 billion in pledges, but the number of SDRs that have actually reached countries is 0. So this needs to be moving a lot faster because countries are really struggling. We've already seen Ghana default on its debts. We've got 60% of low-income countries are in or at high risk of debt distress. This is an emergency situation and we need the international community to move faster.
And you bring up a very important point, David, because it's not only about Ghana. We've also seen Zambia and Chad also tinkering on the verge of debt default. And this definitely shows that there's a lot to be done and it has to happen in the shortest time possible. And what are your thoughts, especially in regards to how do we take the conversation forward and encourage more and more countries to really structure their architectures to be able to tap into this special drawing rights?
Well, the first thing to say is, countries need a lot more finance. If we're looking at financing the energy transition, even if we're looking at the demographic shift where Africa's population has doubled in the past 20 years, we need more debt, we need more finance. The problem is that countries are accessing the wrong type. It's too expensive, it's too short term. And there are mechanisms like multilateral development banks, like special drawing rights that are cheaper and longer term. So we need to unlock those. So the first thing is SDRs can be used to shore up countries' currencies, which is a major issue whenever currencies are depreciating, but countries are still having to service their debt in US dollars. The second is they can be channeled or converted to other currencies to pay for spending, infrastructure projects, health, vaccines, whatever is needed. And the third is this Africa Development Bank proposal, which is really a great proposal, which is to use these resources that rich countries don't need and not to spend them, but use them as leverage so that the African Development Bank can go to capital markets, get cheap finance, and then lend that on to countries to invest in clean energy, in job creating activities. And it's really a kind of a no-brainer, kind of sensible proposal. But the problem is that the system is moving so slowly. There's so much bureaucracy and there are conservatives within the system that are kind of slowing things down. So we need to kind of move this a lot faster, and provide countries with cheap finance that is invested in the right ways, that generates productive economic activity, and ultimately that money can then be paid back on cheaper terms.
And I'd like to bring in Dauda to also give him a chance to weigh in on this very weighty matter. And Dauda, of course, the G20 countries did make that pledge in regards to committing resources that are currently not in use to vulnerable economies. Where do we stand on that pledge, and how are the dynamics falling out from your assessment?
Yes, I think that pledge was quite welcome, as David indicated earlier. We have rules at the International Monetary Funds that guide the allocation of special drawing rights, which are allocated depending on the country's quota. That's why the countries from Africa and low-income countries in general actually got a little share out of the initial allocation. So at this stage, I think out of the 100 billion that was committed, that was pledged by the G20, there is about 60-something billion that were already committed at the IMF. So as you know, there are some subsidized trust at the IMF that can host this type of resources. They call the PRGT and the RST. The problem is that if you only limit the recycling of SDR to the IMF, then you are leaving out a very promising ways of achieving, actually helping countries address those challenges that we talked about, whether it's job creation, whether it is economic recovery, whether it is addressing debt vulnerability, whether it is the climate transition. And if you really want to do a good job of that, you may need on top of the IMF to find a way to channel those SDRs through the multilateral development bank. And the African Development Bank has come up with a very strong proposal on that front that would allow to use those SDRs as to unlink those SDRs to the MDBs and allow them actually to use them to achieve maybe some type of stakeholders that the IMF cannot achieve, whether we are talking about small, medium enterprises, whether we are talking about actually some ways to achieve directly the people and the institutions and enterprises that are affected by the crisis that we are talking about. So we are hoping that hopefully soon the IMF will come up and give an opinion on the IMF, on the proposal by the African Development Bank, so as it can actually give some reassurances to potential contributors of SDRs that you can on-lend your SDRs to the Multilateral Development Bank while keeping their, what they call their reserve asset characteristic, but you can actually do so by relying on their very strong governance framework, their strong risk management framework, but also the fact that those are AAA rated institutions that can use those SDR very well in a way that is complementary to the way the IMF can use them.
And speaking about the quotas, because one of the biggest dilemmas that has continued to face a number of countries, Dauda, is the fact that when you exhaust your quota, you have to wait for the next fiscal year. And I'm just looking at how can this be an opportunity for the private sector to also jump in, because the private sector are also known to have a catalytic effect if they are able to commit some of their funds towards this whole conversation around financing.
Yes, I think you're perfectly right. I think there is a role for the private sector to play, and you cannot talk about solving the job issues or the helping countries recover economically without actually involving the private sector. The problem is when you talk about special drawing rights, there are a limited set of organizations that are eligible for handling the SDRs. A special drawing right is not like a currency that I can put on my pocket and go and buy food at the store. So unfortunately, the private sector cannot use them. But what you can do is you can use the SDRs and lend them to a designated entity like the African Development Bank, so that in return they can also lend those resources to the private sector and allow them to actually contribute contribute to solving the issues that we are talking about. You cannot actually have effective energy transition without involving the private sector. So by on-lending those SDRs, let's say to the African Development Bank or to the Inter-American Development Bank, you can allow those multilateral development banks to use them and achieve the purpose that you are trying to achieve by on-lending them to the private sector. So this is critical, and the IMF cannot do that. The IMF can, of course, lend the resources it has to the government, but it cannot directly lend resources to the private sector. So the best way to achieve that critical act is to do it through the multilateral development bank, and that's the whole idea that we are trying to pursue here. People like David and us have been actually writing and making some research and doing some advocacy to make sure that the G20 really not only accelerate the rechanneling or the recycling of SDR in general, but also make sure that it also reaches the multilateral development bank that can do a good job that the IMF cannot do by necessarily contacting directly some stakeholders like the private sector actors that you talked about.
All right, and Dauda, let me rope in David as we take this conversation home. And David, clearly the role of the private sector is really pronounced, but we're not seeing them stepping forward to be counted in this conversation. From where you sit, how more effective can the private sector play in this whole big conversation that is expected to see African countries be able to access this much needed elusive financing?
Well, the first thing to say is that the private sector is the primary entity that will create jobs, and jobs will be the primary driver of Africa's prosperity. So they have a critical role. And I think a big part of what we're trying to do here is to address a fundamental issue when it comes to the cost of capital. The International Energy Agency did a piece of research in 2020 that showed that if you want to build a solar farm in the US, you would pay an interest rate of 1%. If you want to build that same solar farm in Nigeria, the interest rate is 14%. So there's automatically a challenge for private sector companies that want to invest in clean energy, that want to invest in jobs. And these kinds of mechanisms will help with that, but we need private sector voices to be championing the issue and pushing governments, particularly G20 governments, to take this forward in a much faster way. If you want to learn more about all of this, we've got my organization, the One Campaign, put together a lot of data stories on the issue. So you can go to data.one.org and you can learn all about them and sign up for our mailing list. But I think the issue that we need to address is that this issue is moving too slowly. We're in an emergency. Countries urgently need finance to avoid debt distress and lots of humanitarian suffering. And unless we move this faster, we're going to be in a very, very grave situation in the future.